This is the basics of layering paint. One of the unique traits of using paints is the ability to layer, which means that you can put a layer of paint down and either while it is still wet or when it is dry, you can add another layer. This works both with oil paints and acrylic paints, but considering that most schools, particularly our own school, uses acrylic more than oil, I'm going to focus particularly on acrylic. Oil paint can layer over acrylic, but acrylic cannot layer over oil. So I have a small canvas here. This is a canvas board. So we're going to use this as the media. You can also use a heavier paper like a watercolor paper. I recommend a 140-pound paper or better. And that's just because when you add water or do a wash layer, which I will be discussing in just a little bit, it will soak through the paper. But you can use lighter papers if you do not use a wash layer. But considering that we're using a canvas, a wash layer is something that you want to include. So canvases have a layer of what is called gesso over it. And gesso, if you touch it, it's very coarse feeling. It's almost chalky. And the reason that we use gesso is it absorbs paint and it makes the surfaces easy to paint on. So if you've got a straight canvas, it's really difficult to paint with straight acrylic because the fibers will absorb, it'll push through the weaves of the canvas. So applying a gesso layer allows it to absorb into the gesso instead of the fibers, and it won't penetrate through as much as without the gesso. So a wash layer is typically the first layer that you want to do. And the reason that you are doing this is it helps seal up the gesso so that it's easier to layer on. Gesso absorbs, and if over time, if you do not paint over an area in gesso and leave it just white, it'll actually get yellow because it'll absorb the particles in the air and it'll look dirty. So another feature of using a wash layer is when you're painting, you'll get these little bubbles of white where the gesso is pulling the paint apart when it dries, because paint, when it dries, it contracts. So by doing a wash layer over it, you don't get those little bubbles. You make sure that all the surface area is covered, and then the next layers of paint apply much better. So to make a wash layer, I've got a little tray here with some yellow paint. I'm going to take some water from my water basin. I'm just going to pour a little bit in there. And I'm just going to mix this into the water. So you don't need a lot of paint, but you do need enough to dye the water enough so it almost looks like a watercolor. So once you have this watercolor-like paint, you're going to just take this and apply it to the whole surface. And you'll notice that it's very transparent. That's fine. We just need the binders and a little bit of the pigment on the canvas so that it seals up like we talked about before. Now, when choosing the color for your wash layer, typically you want to have the complementary color of what is used most in your painting. So more times than not, you're going to have blue and green for your backgrounds. You might have different colors, but then you find the complementary. The complementary is the crisscross on the color wheel. So if you look at this color wheel, More times than not, the background is going to be in this range with the blue and the greens because of sky, because of grass, things like that. But you may have other colors as well. So typically when students ask me what color should I be using for my wash layer, I often recommend a orange or a red or something along those lines. Yellow works very well too. But if you're using a lot of orange or red, then you want to go blue or green. So the complementary is the crisscross on your color wheel. So I chose yellow because I've got a lot of yellow and because I'm going to do a night scene. So first layer is the wash layer, and this is the whole area. You mix the complementary color of the color that appears most in the painting, and it's typically orange because of the green or blue that is typically used. So you mix the water with that and you cover the entire area. So the first layer is the wash layer. The second layer is the background layer, and this again does the whole area, so you're going to be covering up the entire wash layer. And this is the area farthest away and closest to the horizon line. And it establishes the horizon line as well. The third layer is the midground, and this goes in the middle and lower areas. This focuses on subject matter that is not the main focus, but adds detail, like trees, building, fences, and people. So I've got a barn, I've got a windmill, I've got a fence there. So the midground is establishing things in the background that add detail but are not the main focus. The fourth layer is the foreground, and it typically is the things that are closest in the focal point. And considering that they are the closest, they are typically the lowest things on your painting. So these focus on what you want to show the most. The final and fifth layer of a painting is the highlights and the shadows. And this typically is to add more detail to show how close, how far, and where light sources come from. So areas of shine get highlights. Those are the closest to the light source. Areas that get shadows and shading are the farthest away from the light source. So the difference between shadows and shading is on the subject matter and shadow is cast from the subject matter. So that is the fifth and final layer. So again, the layers are, the first layer is a wash layer, and that's the whole area. Second layer is the background layer, which is the farthest away and the closest to the horizon line. The third layer is the midground, which is the middle or lower part typically. It can go into the higher parts, and that's subject matter that is not the main focus. The fourth layer is the foreground, and it's typically the lower area or the highest area, and that's subject matter that is the focal point or closest to you, the things that you want people to look at. And the final layer is the highlights and the shadows using either white or black. And this is areas of shine, shadows, or shading. So this is painting with acrylic and how to layer. Thank you for your time and your attention. Do more, do better.